men would die in the Indian culture, and he was married, so the wife would die along with him. And usually they believed in cremation, so they would burn her against her will, with her will, it doesn't matter. This was an old practice that was done from the early centuries, recorded probably in the 1st century, 5th century as well. And many of the people who preached in that area, whether it be Christian or even Muslim, they prevented and had many laws to prevent them from doing this, right? It was banned several times, and it's a sign of a barrier that needs to be stopped. There's other things, for example, like the caste system, which was also rejected, but late on. So the gospel, preaching the gospel in these cultures can give dignity to the woman, gives life, gives eternal life, gives hope, salvation. And it needs to be done oftentimes delicately. But this is the way that the gospel rescues the barriers of culture, right? Or in the Asian culture, for example, female infanticide, because they're just focusing on, right, in terms of the production and the preservation of family, as they understood it. Tribal worship in African culture, as Abuna had mentioned earlier, that especially in Africa, though, the Coptic Church has made probably the best headway among the other churches, at least from what I've seen, what Abuna also saw. And when we go, we preach the Coptic Church as the Church of Africa, because you know that Alexandria, from the Council of Nicaea and before, the Bishop of Alexandria was responsible for all of Africa. It's not just something that was invented later. So it's more native. It's not exactly needs some to address some issues. So that's some of the barriers that we have. How do we build some of the bridges? How do we make cultural relevant? And this is where most of the discussion falls, right? So Christ in his preaching, that there was a language issue, but we know that he was preaching in Aramaic in some places, in Hebrew, especially in the temple, probably to Pilate. He was speaking another language. The Greeks like to say Christ spoke Greek all the time, but as far as we know, we don't have direct evidence. We have indirect evidence. There was also about acceptance, as we heard earlier today about the Samaritan woman, the Canaanite woman who was a Gentile, how that he deals with the Canaanite woman and gives hope to the people who are outside of Judaism. He preached to Tyre and Sidon, not just in Jerusalem by itself, but in the coastal areas where there was an influence of Gentile worship, so in more than one setting. There's also rituals, because this is from the definition of culture. So there's rituals that Christ also targeted. We spoke about circumcision, right? When they're trying to understand what do we do with the law in terms of the gospel. And it was a challenge for the church since the very beginning, but the church met that challenge with a lot of prayer, and like His Grace Bishop Yusuf mentioned in the morning, in council for those big issues. How to deal with the Passover rituals, that was another issue. Like, what do you mean? How are we going to do the Passover now? And that was a transition. That's how we have the liturgy. It's some of the things are based on the Passover rituals. And the like. I think George mentioned this earlier, right? How to become all things to all men. And this verse actually is interpreted and misinterpreted very often. How do we understand how to be Greek to the Greek, right? And Jew to the Jew. Because St. Paul was actually both. Like, he was born, right? And that's why he emphasizes more than you, right? From tribe of Benjamin, Pharisee, son of the Pharisee, studied under Gamaliel. He's full Jew. But at the same time, he had Roman citizenship, and he understood the culture. That's why St. Paul, God called him to preach to the area that was very comfortable for him. In Tarsus and the rest of the Mediterranean area, it was much more comfortable for him than for St. Peter. Was a fisherman, probably he didn't travel much. And that's why when you read in Galatians, and as we were talking in Acts earlier today, which is very heated, a lot of questions and discussion, because St. Peter, it was much harder for him to accept the salvation of the Gentiles. And even when he was preaching to the Gentiles, there was still some class or some differences that inside That's why when we were talking earlier that St. Paul said, I confronted him to his face, because when it concerns doctrine, he has to confront. And there's a nice icon that they have in the Greek Orthodox Church. I wish we have one eventually, where they don't say that they fought and that's it. You don't see them again. They have an icon where they're like cheek to cheek, and the church is in the midst. For St. Peter and Paul, even though they had that difference, through the work of the Holy Spirit was reconciled. Even for St. Mark, in Acts 16, it was reconciled later on. St. Paul says, bring Mark, he's useful for my ministry. Before we had a disagreement about, I don't think that St. Paul considered St. Mark at that time ready to go. He left the service once before. It was a very, very dangerous mission, and he felt he's not ready. I can't take him right now. Barnabas, his uncle, said, I'll take care of him, don't worry. He said, it's my responsibility. So they couldn't agree, and as we heard, that God opened the room for that. For some people, as we also heard, the gospel or the fathers are not yet relevant. They're not yet relevant for many people. So how do we preach Christ to those, as we heard, it's in a different way. There is some background also from the Hellenistic culture, or the Hellenic culture. The use of language, the gospel, the New Testament, pretty much with the exception of Hebrews, was written in Greek. So we know that they just didn't say, we're Aramaic, we're Jewish tradition, let's just focus. No, there was a flexibility of language and of culture. Sayyidina talked, and we talked much about Acts 17, right, when St. Paul is preaching, how that he builds the bridge of the poets and of the Stoics, but of the poets, like he quotes the poets of the Greek. He uses the Stoic philosophy, and what was his great famous introduction in Acts 17? Sayyidina referred, the temple to the unknown. So this is like God puts, and many people have studied this, God puts shadows of truth in many of the religions. Like this, not to say that relative truth. No, I'm saying that God implants, and St. Paul says this in Romans 1, like within the conscience, there are some truths that are buried in many of the other faiths. And they're keys to get them to accept the living God, the true God that we know and that we worship, and the true faith. And when it's placed in, like St. Paul was doing for us, they said, yeah, we have a temple to the unknown. He said, I'm here to tell you about that one. And that's the work of finding that bridge for the culture. When God puts these people in our, or even citing from the poets. He had no problem to cite from the poets, but he explains it, or he baptizes the phrase with perfect theology. And it's easy to say, but to actually do it in the right way, I think it needs the work of the Holy Spirit. How do we see that the church, right, expanded in Ethiopia, the Coptic church, established, the story of Fermentius, right, Ethiopia and Eritrea, that the church said the gospel should be preached there, and there was one eager Fermentius, eager to preach, and so St. Athanasius said, go. After he began to evangelize, preach Christ, and he came back, he said, they need a bishop. He said, okay, I ordain you a bishop. Go back. And that's how the church, so there's a big difference in liturgy, big difference in hymns, even in vestments, but the faith, it's the same. Same with the church in India, in Armenia. You probably read a lot of all of these and heard how the church grew in these areas. Even in Switzerland, that God put, wherever the Christians ended up in the 4th and 5th century, the Coptic church, they converted, like 2 or 3, they can take care of a countries. Not now, like we could send teams for months and years, but the work of God to be manifest there. How to make bridges. If you look just at the Coptic hymns, they found that the influence of the Coptic hymns, it was borrowing from different traditions. Some of them from the Greek and Byzantine, like Agios, Homogenes, Christos Anesti, that we say in our church today, are borrowed by word and sometimes the tune. Like for the Feast of Resurrection, we have 2 Christos Anesti, right? The first one is the Coptic version. The second one, which was borrowed and adapted, because if you'll notice it, like it's kind of short and it's too almost like military style, the second one. But the Coptic worship flavor is more the first one. Very festal. It could take much longer because we have big churches. We have to go around the big, like we just at the second, what are we going to do for the rest of the time? And it gives the feeling or the impression of that feast. There's also a Jewish influence, and this is debatable how much. So even the Alleluia that we say and how we read the Psalms, even if you look in the 4th century, from what we know, some scrapes here and there, that there was some influence of how they incorporated Jewish worship into the liturgy. It was like it was a fluid work. Or the Turkish and Byzantine influence later on, not always Christian even, right? This probably is not. It depends on how the history worked. Or even some Egyptian compositions, natural, like Kulla Sufuf, that's very modern, very, very late. That's why it's only in Arabic. But we needed something there. There's something in liturgical history, they say there's soft points. Like in general, like the church didn't like too many silent points. So whenever there was like somewhere we had to go, leave, they just like, when the Pope might come and there's a lot of things to like sing any hymn. So the church kind of does that in a way. When Abuna has to go around with a censer, he used to sometimes bless every single person. He said, okay, we need Taishori, we need Hitani, find something else too. In the big feast, you have to put something extra. So we have introduction to this reading, introduction to that reading. But that's some things, and I don't get too into this, but there's flexibility there, right? Like you're not going to necessarily say the long hitani on a Wednesday liturgy or in the liturgy that we had this morning, so we're not going to finish. Or in Tazbahah, for example, we have some hymns that have small, medium, and long version. It's there. Like we're not making it up. We're in a rush, but it's not like Shairin Maria. We have the long version. We take our time. Where we don't have as much. Okay, we have medium, and then we have the quick version. Yes.
Turkish, if you should like.
For the vestments, for example, like like the crown and when we went on Easter, some of the cape, the bornos, and some of those, like if you look in the pictures of the 19th century patriarchs, the popes, in the 19th, they look very different than what Pope Shenouda Tawadros wears today. There was an influence at that time of the Byzantine, when the Byzantine Empire came in like the 6th, 7th century, they incorporated a lot of their vestments to match what the emperor wore. So the emperor had a big crown, they got a big crown. The emperor had the big cape, they have a train, like in a wedding. So in the patriarch in the Byzantine, they have this long robe and the deacon carries. That came from the emperor, as far as I know, it didn't have anything to do with the patriarch. That's why we don't have it. We have a cape, yes, which has its own symbolism. So there's a lot of, that's why doing this, as Sayyidina mentioned, to be very cautious, has to be very well studied. I remember I wanted to do liturgy, and one of the priests was my professor in Armenian church. He's also a priest. He said, you have to do liturgy. I'm like, so why? He's like, we don't have any liturgists, Coptic liturgists. I'm like, why not? He said, well, you have to know Coptic, you have to know Greek, you have to know Latin, you have to know French and German, and you have to that's just the beginning, and then you have to go and study, and then you have to have access to the manuscripts, and you have to do it in the right way. It's a big mess. So that's why there's not many. But that doesn't mean we're not going to attempt. We have a lot of people to study. Like now when Sayyidina was talking about some of the books recently done by Abuna Athanasius Ma'ari, one of the great monks, and he began to collect a lot of these manuscripts and publish them, because we didn't have the freedom or the ability or the awareness to go and look and see, well, why did this hymn change? Where did we get this from? How come this doesn't make sense? Why is in one area in Egypt, for example, Basra was different than another area? And still sometimes today, if you go to that city, it's very different. So our church is now starting to investigate, and thank God we have a lot of people looking into these, and they're deliberating, and there's committees that are put in place to see. So someone says, you know what, I don't like that hymn, skip it, right? Or why do we have 5 readings? Make it 2. Because people can do that. It's too long. No. So it has to be done with study and with careful deliberation. But that doesn't mean that we're worshiping this book or worshiping this rite or worshiping. No, we're worshiping the living God, and we take care. This is what we received. We don't want to tinker with with it, right? The Pharaonic. Yes, Bekithronos. So as far as we know, the hymn came from the ancient. According to the No, the tune. Yes. So according to what most people say, like I haven't read it yet, like I haven't seen the documentation, but most probably, they attribute it to Saint Athanasius. He came, and there was a praise that was done when they buried the pharaoh, and when even after Christianity they were still singing this hymn. So he said, "What are you doing? We have Christ. Why are you singing this hymn at the time?" He said, "Okay, fine. You like the hymn?" So he took Psalm 22 and he put the words to the hymn, and that's how we had the hymn for Good Friday. And also some of these hymns, like Monogenes, was used also in the patriarch, like when the ordination of the patriarch, like we saw, they have some of those hymn related. So our tradition is very rich, and sometimes we have a lot of things we don't understand. Like even for us, I would say we don't fully understand when we go deep, just like with the scripture in some cases. Like if you have a verse, it doesn't make sense. And someone say, that doesn't make sense. How can you? And you go deep in that verse, it's amazing. Like it'll prove itself. It doesn't need us. But God reveals himself through it. When you have an honest heart, when you have work and search the scriptures, right? Christ said, "For in them is eternal life." And our church is that way. When you search deeply, you might find things, it doesn't make sense. Okay, let's look more. Maybe the second level, third level, and then we're able to make the reasoned decision through the work of the Holy Spirit. So I don't get in trouble, I'll quote some of the bishops. Actually, that's why you can see the work of God many times through the church as a whole. Every once in a while you'll find the same topics being repeated in different places without coordination. So last week, the graduate retreat was on the similar topic on culture and the church. And so I'm just citing from what Sayyidina said. So one of the reasons for the survival of the Coptic Orthodox Church until today is the ability of the church to deal with culture. And he took the example, for example, in North Africa, you had two main churches, in Carthage and Hippo, where Augustine was, and in the west, Alexandria, where we know we were. But when Islam came into the region, it wiped out the west. There's no Christianity there for centuries. I mean, very, very little. But in the east, it still continued and thrived. There's no gaps. Even no matter what the persecution, thank God, the church is alive and well. Why? It seems that there was no integration within the culture in the east. It was still in Latin, and the Christians were always on the margin of society. There was always a division, too much of a division. So if we can properly deal with culture, it's essential for the survival and the growth of the Coptic Church in America and Canada and Europe, which is moving from a church of immigrants to a church of citizens, or from being on the margins of society to a mainline church. That doesn't mean we accept what's going on in the media and the mainstream. No, that means to be in dialogue and as part of the community in the world, but not of the world. So we accept we are here in America, in American culture, but how that it's not part of us, but we are here to change. God sent us with this mission. But then comes the question, a barrier, if we apply it to the American culture. What is American culture? Is it American Indian? Is it the colonial American who came in the next century? Is it the industrial American that came right afterwards in the 19th century? Why we have the Germans and the Polish and the Italians, right? These were the first wave of immigrants. Is it the post-industrial American, right? African American, Latin American, Asian American, or what most people will consider the popular culture, right? Baseball, hamburgers, and jeans. This is like when people think of American Western culture, that's what we think about. Or is it somehow a combination of all of these to understand where we are? I'm not answering, I'm just asking the question. Now we are approaching what's called a global culture, where it's not just by country, but you'll see the globalization of an ideology or even food. Like if you go, they had a commercial a long time ago, they were telling us in school, where someone had moved, like they immigrated from China or from Tokyo to America, and they felt at home because the McDonald's that they had over there is the same as the McDonald's here. Like it's completely reversed. You see the idea? Like that's not to say that they'll feel American because they have McDonald's. That's how it used to be. Like when you go to Egypt or you go travel somewhere, oh yeah, they have Starbucks or they have this. Now we feel at home. No, it's the opposite. When they come here, they'll feel at home because it's already home for them over there. That's a globalization of a certain culture, and we're getting there. We're a long way, but this is the age I think that we're dealing with. So culture by itself is always changing. So what do we do if we change in the church whatever we want based on the culture? Like we'll always be changing, like you can't keep up. But that's why it goes gradually, slowly, very methodically. How do we overcome some of the barriers? So in 2002, Sayyidina was speaking about some of the barriers, and he put some guidelines, right? To have the liturgy fully in English, and now we have PowerPoint. We have most of the time, right? Sermon in English. We have welcoming committee, or he was proposing it. I don't know if the churches have it now. I'll leave that question. But he was proposing, 11 years ago, right? For a welcoming committee and congregation. I heard that phrase more than once. Reminds me of a story. I was serving once in a city, and, Oh, in 2002, I am not sure. Maybe, I think so. But I was serving in a place where usually I don't serve in a parish, but at that time there was no priest, so Sayyidina said, go there for a couple months till we get another priest. I said, okay. So I went to the church. They pray in that church at 8:30. So I went a few minutes, a little bit before, and someone came just before 8:30. And first question, he said, where are the people? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I didn't recognize him. He said, aren't you supposed to start at 8:30? I said, yes. I could tell he's a visitor. I had to start, so I said, okay, I'll be right back. There was no one else in the church, very small church. And he brought his drink, and he came and sat in the pew, which was fine. So when the first person came, I told him, okay, can you make sure? He said, Abuna, there's someone. I said, there's only 2 people in the church. I know that there's someone, he's not Egyptian. And he came at 8:30, take care of him. Of course, he didn't. By the time as he was drinking and sitting, and people were complaining, he said, well, you know that we don't have a sign that says no drinking or eating. And there was no one to seat him properly or explain. And we didn't invite him. Like Sayyidina was saying, you're not going to invite people to liturgy. But we found him, like I opened the church, you find him coming. So that's why, maybe you might not have a whole committee. And in this church, it's very small. Like I told them before, preparing them, actually in this church, we had to bring servants from another state to help, and still it needs some work. To see how we have, even in the small congregations, we have to have our and unfortunately with this person, like I was planning, I told someone, make sure he doesn't leave so I can talk to him after. Because small church, by the time we give the Yulugayat, he actually left in the middle of the service. Don't know his name, don't know his number, because there was no one there, and I couldn't leave. Like, it's not like I had a deacon, I had to do, deacon or something. So in that case, like Sayyidina said, it can't be the priest. Like, to welcome, we can welcome at the end of the liturgy, but in the liturgy or in any other service, in a Bible study, for example, if we're leading a Bible study, we can't welcome the people in the middle of the Bible. We could try, but we might lose those people by the time we finish the service. So just take language, another sensitive issue, but to show you the development. Stage 1, when the church first came here, so Arabic was the predominant language in the liturgy. And there was English in Sunday school, youth meetings, and Saturday liturgy. This is like between the 70s, early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, right? And then stage 2 was English, more predominant language on Sunday. If I take the midnight praise as an example, usually we'd have 50-50, either English and Coptic or English and Arabic. But now I think we're approaching, in most of the churches, a new stage, which we didn't anticipate, but it's a new stage. So we find almost, in some of the big churches I'm talking about, in the Midwest, in the East, I'm not very familiar with the South, but you'll tell me. So you almost will find 2 churches in one, parallel churches, the larger churches, parallel services, but the shift is going, because we have to meet the needs of the immigrants, or our brothers and sisters who came from Egypt, you know the circumstances. But in dealing with both, the church is kind of pulled in 2 directions. Not that we can't, like the church's role is to welcome all of her children, but in a setting, you might find that there's 2 tensions at the same time. How to deal with it, that's where the issue now is circulating. I know in some churches, the policy, we do Sunday school in English no matter what for the kids. But there were some kids who are coming, they don't understand a word of English. And there are some kids that don't understand a word of Arabic. So how to deal with that new situation, there's different. Some say English no matter what, they're going to get it in school. Other people say we'll have a separate. Some people say just in certain ages. Different opinions, but it's a problem. Or in the Tasbih, I remember where when we were always growing up, it's just Coptic and English, right? But there are some places like their tension. So how to include, when to include, how much to include in Arabic? Do you sacrifice the Coptic? Again, it's a new issue. Or do we have to need an entirely new parish? In terms of Bible study, but in one of the big churches that I was serving in, so over 600 families, I was surprised. I found they had 3 or 4 Arabic Bible studies regularly, and not one regular English Bible study in the church, not counting the sermon. And I went to ask. I said, well, I'm not there during the week. I only help on the weekends. But they used to have from time to time, but it would fall in. But just to see the mentality, like we were saying, Sayyidina was saying, the importance of an English Bible study, which is very basic. I remember when we start a new church, English-speaking church, the most important thing, of course the liturgy is going to be all English, but the most important thing was for that English Bible study, because it's the driving force of the spiritual life and of the service there. And it's been at least 10 years, very consistent. That church grew tremendously because of that focus. Okay. Another question that came up with one of these new churches okay, fine, you have all of the liturgy in English, maybe you do all the services in English, all the times of the year. But there was a very big, almost crisis that happened because the hall, when they would enter into the hall, it's very different than when you enter into the church. Like the church, you don't have to talk to them. You're not supposed to talk. You're not having conversations, although some people still do, in the pews. But when you walk into the hall and you find that you can't talk to, you don't understand it, or you're sitting at the table and everyone around you is talking in a different language, it's not welcoming. So even if you have a welcoming committee in the church, it's a challenge. I'm not proposing solutions right now. So this is one of the issues. Or in the events, baptism, birthday, whatever. The people from the outside, like non-Egyptian, will come. It's something we're not all aware of, or we're aware of it, and we're finding ways to address it, because it's important. How do we overcome some of the barriers? In terms of education. So I asked this question, how many special services are offered to pre-catechumen and catechumen? So Sayyidina mentioned this earlier today. What do I mean by this? So some churches, like the mission, new parishes, they have an introductory course that's different from the catechism course. And if people are coming from different Christian denominations, then a Bible study will be enough. But if they don't accept the Bible or are still, what is this Bible? They're not familiar with it, they may need a course, some apologetics, some about main principles, not just of faith, of honesty, of the Bible itself, like where did we get the Bible, that help to deal with it. And there's different different approaches to it. And I know one of the churches, they chose like a dinner setting, so they have a free meal. They offer this. It's like 20-minute lecture, and the rest of it is mainly discussion. And it's organized, but it's not really felt that it's organized. Do you know what I mean? Like they know exactly what's going to happen, and they have one person at the table that kind of guides the discussion. They're like a coordinator. They have a subject they're going to discuss, very non-threatening, and it's outside of the church usually. Like it's not the church that was doing this, they don't even have a place they could do this. So they invite people, they do this, and then the people who are interested, they invite them to a retreat, and from that retreat, they ask them if they have a second course, and then they go to catechism. The people say, I want to become Christian, and that's when they start, with the Bible studies and with the I know one of the churches, they decided for catechism on the time of Sunday school, that they have a special class always going. And even the people who, after their baptism, they continue in this class because it's their group, continuing education. And they're free to, but most of them prefer to do this. They still have a lot to learn. So they continue in that program. It also doesn't, the individual discussion with the priests and the servants. And there's something also post-baptismal course. Sayyidina said he's not going to teach about the liturgy in the beginning. You talk about the gospel. In the early church, that's exactly what they did. They preached in the gospel, and then there was a catechism period, and then after baptism, they had a post-baptismal catechesis. You've heard of, right, Cyril of Jerusalem, 4th century. So he said, okay, now that you've been baptized, let me tell you about the liturgy. Let me explain to you the things. They said, well, why didn't you do that before? He said, you weren't able to understand with the mind of Christ, and that it works like it's a gradual learning. There are some things, even if I explain, that's why they wouldn't let them attend the liturgy in the end part of the liturgy, because they weren't ready for it. Not because, unholy, fire is going to come. No. So after the teaching, they said, let them receive the teaching. Once they receive the baptism, now it's time for you to approach, and this is what Eucharist is. This is what the sacraments are. Okay. Some of the rules, like we said, taken for granted, food and drink, church attire, communion, all of these things can be dealt with later on. But I remember we had a discussion with some of the priests to put a sign in the churches about, no food and drink, no smoking, and who can take communion, like just in case. In some of the older Catholic churches, if you go in, you find a list of the rules. Who can take communion? 1, 2, 3, who can't take? Or what do you do? Like if you want to just take a blessing instead of or if you go into a Antiochian Orthodox church on a Sunday, right, what will you find? You find not only greeters, they'll tell you, okay, where are you from? So you tell them, Coptic church, or you tell them, okay, come with me, I'll tell you where to sit. And the priest knows, because it's already, I remember once we were attending there was a visit of patriarch, I think from the OCA, so we went, they found out, although the church was half full, they made us sit in a certain row. Said, why are we sitting here and not there? It's not like a lot of people are coming. Why? So the priest and the clergy, they know that we are, can't take communion, and we're visitors and we come for a blessing. So after the service, like it's non-verbal, but it meets the need. Is this cooperating? Okay. I'm gonna have to go one by one. So there's also in terms of social integration. Okay, yeah, it's the same point for the welcoming of non-Egyptians. And there's this last point, which is also very challenging. that there needs to be some social education for the Egyptian, especially for those recently who came from Egypt. There are even differences in Egypt, like as you know, like there are different areas and regions and different practices, even the way you speak. One time I was visiting one of the priests in Egypt, so I'm sitting with him, and then someone came in, and one started yelling at him. So after he left, he apologized to me. He said, I know you're asking me why I yell at him. He said, unfortunately, with this type of person, if I don't yell, he doesn't take me serious. Like, if I'm talking like I'm talking to you, he thinks that I'm, it's unimportant, irrelevant. So I have to yell at him. And he's not like, I could tell he's not visibly angry. He's just yelling. So he'll do it. And he joked and he said, with this type of, it's a subculture in Egypt, but that's what they're used to. So to evangelize even to our own people, it needs different. I told him there's no way. Like, I couldn't do it with a straight face, like, to yell at the guy. So there are some boundaries. Respecting boundaries, personal boundaries, is very different. Usually in Egypt, there's no such thing as privacy. Everyone lives together, subject, open, from the very first. So it can be very off-putting to any guest. Talk about, just or how to respect certain differences. Like, some people may mock right away, not intentional, but like or someone explained it to me this way, that the way that, I think, was it Abuna, or one of the servants was joking in a way that was very offensive, but he didn't intend it that way. That's the way in their area they joke. But every time he would make a joke, it would offend the guests. So they were asking me to tell them, don't have him, just speak normal, no jokes. Another thing, which in terms of social integration, is that even if someone is baptized and enters into the church, we don't always have, they may not have a full tie to the church if they're not fully integrated in the church, which means having a role in the service. And it doesn't mean they're going to teach Sunday school or give the sermon or give the youth meeting, because sometimes we end up doing that and it doesn't work in the beginning. But they're excellent, usually in the organization, when you compare from Egypt to America, that they're gifted in this. And many of them, they have a vision. They say, well, why are you doing it this way? You should be doing 1, 2, 3. That doesn't make sense. And they have many gifts that if we knew how to use, knew how to incorporate into the church. For example, when you have an open house, sometimes you put them in the information booth. So they don't have to tell the answers, but they know how to, they welcome much better than we welcome. Or even in the Orthodoxy course, like I told you, there's a coordinator. So some of them, after they took the 1 or 2 courses, they would, and say they're being baptized or in the catechism, that it's enough for them to guide a discussion, because the discussion leader doesn't have all the answers. Their job is just to help everyone to speak. And when there's a big issue, they'll call for some help. Okay. In terms of the bridging of American culture, this is where I could, what time do we go to? There are some things where the church was able to baptize. Like we talked about, Abuna talked about Halloween a little bit. So most of our churches have a way to say, okay, we can accept the concept of celebrating the saints, right? Which was All Hallows Eve. But there are some things that we can't accept. So how do we make it acceptable for the children in a safe environment with the right meaning? Or Mardi Gras, for example. What's right in that? But the original meaning from it, right? The pre-Lent celebration, of course, it's a complete mess. But how are we aware of it? Or the New Year's celebration, that there's an inappropriate way, but there's a way that we celebrate in the church, like all of the churches have an evening service, kiyak or whatever. How that we celebrate the January 7th, December 25th, that issue, that's a challenge. That's a whole topic by itself. So there's a lot of ways that the church, in dealing with the culture of America, which we are all American, how to redefine or understand it as something important and valuable. This is another issue of music, and what are the guidelines? Musical notation was one of the scholars. I think that was his name, Newland Smith, right? Who put all of the hymns of the church in musical notation, Western musical notation, so people could follow or know, oh, this is what they. And if you have a pianist expert, he would be able to play for you the Coptic, bascha or liturgy on the. Okay, I think. Oh, this is just some things to think about. So in the region that we are in, there's also some subculture, we say in America, that also helps to understand. So in the Midwest, which drives me crazy when it's football season, which is all the time, that they could change their services, like a servants meeting, no servants meeting because there's a big game. Yeah. For the servants. Are you joking or is it? So no, because they're serious. So I stopped. Oh, you are? Okay, I could tell. I should have known. Or say, for example, in the East, they're very intellectual and very political. Like Sayyidina said, there's a way to deal with politics, but when we are serving, we have to have that awareness. In the West, we struggle with the entertainment and the shallowness. There's a shallow culture in general. Like the people, I'm talking about non-Egyptian, but in general, when I went to the East Coast the first time, they joke about the people in the West because they can't have meaningful conversation. So we deal with that spiritually. Awareness of the general subculture helps us to serve, say, well, how come the youth here, how come they're not paying attention? How come they can't read? Well, they don't like to read more than one page. It doesn't work. Why? Okay, there's reasons. Okay, I skipped one from Hawaii. Because we found that although it's part of America, most Americans don't know. They think, do we need a passport because we're going to Hawaii? It's one of the 50 states. It's not contiguous. But they have a completely different culture, although we're still in America, even in Alaska too. But the OCA understood this. So there's many values there in the culture that when we go to preach, and there's, thank God, a regular service there, that the Hawaiians especially are searching for a church, and there's a very close relationship with the Coptic church. And then one of the guys I met, he told me, he said, the Coptic church is very closer to the Hawaiians than the Malaysian. I said, what do you mean? He said, and he started to tell me some of the pharaonic history and some of the words in hieroglyphic compared to the words in Hawaiian. I said, he said, yeah, I studied this. And so he's saying there are people like that. The church is relatively easy for them to accept. Okay, I think, God bless you. So how do we move from being a destination church to community? I had a conversation with one of the visitors a couple weeks ago, and he said, your church is a destination church. I said, what do you mean? Okay. How do you move from a destination church to a community church? Which is, I said, what do you mean? He said, all of your people drive in. I said, yeah, that's what, in Egypt we walk to the church, but here we drive. What do you want us to do? He said, no, when I grew up, we lived around the church and we go to the church. But now even most of the big mega churches in America, there's a destination. The church has to be part of the community. And you should have service. He said the only time when you have your festival or whatever, that we see you and you're very nice and friendly. But after that, there's no relationship between the church and the immediate society that you're living in. Do you even know who the mayor is of your, he didn't ask this, but do we know, or do we know what's going on in the city council? Maybe there's a few people that should be aware of this. Or how active are we in the society? And finally, to make an invitation, I think I won't exhaust this. We talked about it before, but how we can how the church can make that invitation to culture and have, culture-friendly service without any compromise to the faith. Last point, I promise. It's 3 points, but the last point, I'll just list them, which is how to have the guidelines when you want to evaluate, is this part of culture? Or what do we do with this aspect of the church, inside or outside? 3, I got these again from Abdelsayed. First one, how to discern between the faith and culture, right? The early church is our reference, our guide to understand, well, what is part of the church teaching, heritage, doctrine, practice, and something that came after that could be adjusted. Second, which is the common apostolic heritage, or a comparison with other churches. Like when you look in the Catholic Church, when you look in the OCA, when you look in the Greek Orthodox Church, when you look at some of these, you might, even some of the Presbyterians, some of the Lutherans, there are some remnants of the apostolic tradition. Like when you find it, you say, okay, that's why we did, like when you like to study liturgy, you find certain things, you say, oh, that makes that very important for us to understand what we are doing. And the third thing, which is the pastoral need, and I know in one of the parishes, they wanted to sit as a family. So they went to Sayyidina and said, why are we sitting men and women? They don't do that anywhere else in the culture. So we just want them to sit together. So I said, well, wait a second. Do you know why? So one of the persons sent me an email. I need to know why you have this. Is it just from Islamic culture? I said, no. You look in the Didascalia, it's there. They had not just separation between men and women, actually between every group. Like they had the widows sitting together. They had the elderly sitting together. They have a place for the nuns or monks if they're attending the service. So it means that everyone, they wanted to put that everyone had a certain mission, that for them to pray together and worship, even in that proximity, will help their spiritual life. So Sayyidina was saying, if the family has this need, we're willing to do it, as long as it's designated and as long as it's going to assist the family unit, because now the family is being threatened in our culture and in the world, the true family, any family, it's being attacked in all directions. If this will help them, then there's a way to allow for it. So thank you for your patience. Anyone have any questions? Not too much, because I know how much time. Okay. 10 minutes? Is that enough for the discussion? Or is it? Okay. Okay, so I had proposed for, you sure we have the time for the discussion, or you want to postpone it? Okay. I'm curious, at least if they could start it, and then afterwards, what do they have? Okay, how about I explain to them, and then you could, at least they could get into the groups, and so you know who you are, and then if you have time in the evening to continue. But from the discussion in the afternoon, this came to mind as an assignment or a project that would help. In dealing with culture, if I were to give you the assignment of establishing a curriculum or a program that you would have from someone coming in from the door until baptism and until heaven, like lifelong. But I'm only thinking a 2-year plan as a proposal to His Grace Bishop Yusuf, or if you're outside. So I just wanted to divide in 2 groups, which is inside the diocese and outside the diocese, and to see how you can put a 2-year plan and how would you do it. Like, I don't need all the classes, but what I want to say, okay, first you want to start with open house, or you're going to start with how to bring in the flock. Then, what are their needs? Okay, we said Bible study. We said English literature. And then if you're in the diocese, for example, you can pick the parish or the priest or whatever. Like, just put a plan. And like, if you can fit on a page, is better. and then you submit it to Sayyidina. So then we don't go home and complain. No, but at least you said, okay, this is our part. This is what we're thinking of doing. And Sayyidina might say, excellent, we'll do it tomorrow. He might say, thank you. No, thank you. Or it may, at least we did our part, right? If it's well reasoned and if it's argued, then who knows? It might be the plan for the American churches in all of the dioceses.
How long time will have? 3 months or?
No, to do the plan? No, I'm saying if you do one page, I'm pretty sure, like, if it's very well done. Anyone here in marketing and business analysis? Or, okay, then it's okay. So if it's very well done, if the first page is very well presented, then I'm sure Sayyidina would assemble a committee. We have a couple of those. Assemble a committee and say, okay, what do you think? Look into this, right? At least some major points, and especially if you select the priest in the parish, like appropriately, maybe that's all we would need to do. So you, at least if you want to just get into those groups, then you have the rest of the night to figure it out. If you decide to do nothing, then okay, at least I'm free. I can sleep at night.
When does your reverence want us to get together to propose this?
To propose it, I mean,
Are we going to propose it in groups or just give to your reverence each group's paper?
I have to look at the schedule to see when that you would have the time to meet, first of all. And then I mean, if you have the paper, like, to present to me is not as important, but I would love to hear it, like, I want to hear it. I don't know. I don't know what the schedule.
This isn't verified. It was just on paper, but 5 to 5:15 is a break, and then 5:15 to 6:30 is going to be George, and then 6:30 to 7 is another break.
Probably in
7 to 7:30 is vespers. 7:30 to 8:30 is dinner, and then from 8:30 to 10 would be the movie discussion.
okay, if it seems like if they could get it like right before the midnight praise, so like by the end of the day, like by 10, if you could get at least, we could get 5 minutes in the schedule right before we start, just to see what was done. Yeah, for them to meet.
I mean, I'm sure if you talk to Caroline, and if you guys take a vote on it, you guys probably do.
Yeah. But I mean, I think it's you have a chance in this to actually make an impact or set in terms of the vision of, it's a very practical application for what you've been doing for the past 13, 14 years.
The movie might help to
Guide.
everybody a little bit more about proposing something like this, because the movie, I think, addresses some important topics. So maybe between the movie and the discussion, the
Okay.
groups can finalize whatever they're going to do.
Sounds good.
They can meet during the break time and then present the final thing.
Yeah, you have a marathon today. Oh, did we skip the free time?
No, she shifted
Everything again?
just to make up for the right. We got a break for 15 minutes.
Right now?
Yes.
Enjoy. I apologize.